On this 6.7 Power Stroke Superduty, P0521 is an engine oil pressure sensor or switch, A range performance code. In plain language, the PCM may be seeing an oil pressure signal that does not line up with expected operation. The truck may show an oil pressure warning, the gauge may act incorrectly, or the only obvious symptom may be the stored code. Possible fault areas can include the oil pressure sensor side, actual engine oil pressure, module communication, or the way the PCM, gateway, and cluster handle the oil pressure message. For PCM P052100, the diagnostic action is to move into the dedicated pinpoint test for this code. That is the important split point. Do not jump straight into gauge or cluster testing just because the concern involves oil pressure display. At that handoff, pause and use the complete next test before making a parts call. Without that next test, there is not enough supported information here to condemn the sensor, wiring, PCM, cluster, or any other part for P0521. If P0521 shows up while you are chasing an incorrect analog engine oil pressure gauge indication, start that gauge path with the correct schematic and connector information available. Also keep the cluster message behavior in mind. If the oil pressure warning request is missing for less than 5 seconds, the cluster holds the last gauge indication it received. If that request is missing for 5 seconds or longer, the cluster defaults the engine oil pressure gauge to 0 psi. That matters because a gauge reading can be a communication default, not automatically proof of actual engine oil pressure. From there, run the IPC self-test and check for recorded cluster codes. If the cluster has codes, check what they mean first. If it does not, run the PCM KOEO self-test. On this diesel, when this oil pressure code group is recorded there, the gauge test does not keep going inside the cluster path. It hands the diagnosis over to the 6.7 electronic engine control side. That complete engine control path is not available here, so stop at that handoff and do not guess past it. If the PCM KOEO self-test does not record a code, keep following the gauge path. Check the gateway continuous memory codes. If gateway communication codes are present, deal with the network concern first. If no gateway codes are recorded, go into the IPC PIDs, control the oil press percentage PID, and make sure the scan tool is set to 0 psi before starting that command test. Command the oil pressure gauge on and off while watching the gauge. If it moves to high when commanded on and returns to low when commanded off, the gauge can respond and the path moves to engine oil pressure testing. If it does not respond that way, the path moves to the cluster connector checks. When the commanded gauge response is correct, test the engine oil pressure. If an engine oil pressure concern is found, repair that engine oil pressure concern. If engine oil pressure is not the concern, continue with oil pressure sensor and warning indicator diagnosis rather than blaming the gauge. When the gauge does not respond correctly to the command, turn the ignition off, disconnect and inspect the IPC connector. Fix corrosion, damaged pins, bent pins, or pushed out terminals as needed. Then reconnect the IPC connector and make sure it seats and latches correctly. Operate the system again. If the concern is gone, the system is operating correctly at that time, and the connector issue may have been the cause. If the concern is still present, check OASIS for an applicable TSB, GSB, SSM, or FSA. If one applies, follow that direction. If none applies, the path supports installing a new IPC. The takeaway is simple. P0521 on this truck is not a parts call by itself. The supported routing sends it into a dedicated oil pressure engine control diagnostic path, and the gauge diagnosis route hands it off the same way on the diesel when that oil pressure code group is present. Use the gauge path only when you are actually diagnosing an incorrect analog gauge indication. Keep the communication defaults in mind, and separate gauge response for real engine oil pressure. After any supported repair, verify the repair and confirm the code stays gone. For more diagnostic training, visit stepdiagnostics.com.